2 years ago, Ayn Rand's first television interview from 1959 was posted on ARI's YouTube channel. And as we speak, that interview has attracted more than 1.2 million views. So to celebrate, we're going to have this watch party. We're going to talk for about a half hour, and then we'll spend the second half hour listening to and watching this historic interview with Ayn Rand. I'm joined today by Brandon Lisi. He's assistant archivist and researcher with the Ayn Rand Archives. Welcome, Brian.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. It's it's a real honor to be with you here today.
All right, so that started off awkward, but let's start in on this interview because what I want to do today is set the interview in some historical context, in the perspective of Ayn Rand's public visibility. So, during the 1940s, Rand became a public figure for the first time. She published The Fountainhead in 1943. It became a bestseller. In the late 1940s, you may know, she testified before Congress. She was activist in terms of fighting communist influence in Hollywood. But after that, she was more or less invisible during the Eisenhower years when she was busy writing Atlas Shrugged, and busy is an understatement. It's just this Herculean labor to produce that book. So if we fast forward to 1957, she's about to publish Atlas Shrugged, and she needs publicity. Like any author with a new book, she needs publicity. And this is where I want to give credit to Mike Wallace, because most of you may know Wallace as a correspondent for 60 Minutes, CBS 60 Minutes. That's where he became a household name in the 70s and 80s. But back in the 1950s, he was just getting started as a national figure. He had a pretty long history in radio and early TV as a kind of plain vanilla entertainment personality. You wouldn't think of him as hard-hitting or controversial at all. But right at the time Atlas Shrugged was published, coincidentally, he was really developing a persona as a hard-hitting, controversial interviewer. And interestingly enough, he became kind of a one-man publicity machine for Ayn Rand, starting with publication year 1957 and going on 4 or 5 years up to 1961. So I just want to give you a little bit of Mike Wallace's story. So it was 1957. He had a local TV show in New York City, and they got the idea to kind of revamp it. He and his production team. We'll talk about some of the people on his production team later, maybe. But he got the idea for an innovative approach to interview shows. So they used to be very polite and on a well-lit set with plants and a table, and everybody's, balancing their teacups and having a polite conversation. Here comes Mike Wallace with this innovative show called Night Beat. This was, I think, 1956, maybe. And it was you could tell it was going to be different just from the set. The story behind it is they didn't have any money for a set, so they just did it very plain. But it's this stark black background with white lights. It's kind of like a police interrogation room. You show shine the bright light in the suspect's face. And Wallace, with his Night Beat show, quickly built a reputation for tough questioning, controversial guests. And this kind of led through some steps that I'll talk about here to a series of publicity events, that really gave Ayn Rand some public visibility when she needed it. I've prepared a little graphic that we could put on the screen, I think, to summarize these efforts, and it'll give us kind of a skeleton to go on. I'll talk about these. In 1957, there was a Mike Wallace column. He had a newspaper interview. in 1958, he interviewed Ayn Rand in connection with the National Book Awards, an interview that attracted publicity from reporters who were there. In 1959, at Boldface, this is the interview that we're about to watch. And then later on, 1960 and 61, follow-up interviews that brought her in contact. One of them brought her in contact with Barry Goldwater, who was an up-and-coming politician, and there was a history of their contact after that. And then some of you may have watched the event that we did with the Ayn Rand Mickey Spillane interview that Mike Wallace did in 1961. That's up on YouTube. So this is just to tell you that it wasn't just this one interview. Mike Wallace really recognized, I think, in Ayn Rand, a really interesting television figure. Somebody who's controversial, somebody he could ask hard questions of and get straight answers. Because as we know, Atlas Shrugged presents a radical and controversial philosophy, and as reviews of the book came out, they were decidedly mixed. A lot of negative reviews, and Ayn Rand was something of a hot potato. It would have been very easy to just say, no, we're not going to talk to her. She's too controversial. But Mike Wallace, to his credit, I think it took courage for him to do what he did, was keep on publicizing Ayn Rand. So just to go back to the beginning of the story then, in 1957, Atlas Shrugged is about to be published by Random House. And they, as part of their publicity efforts, Random House sets up meetings with journalists and so forth. And as nearly as I can tell from the archive, there was a meeting set up in September of 1957 with Rand and Mike Wallace's production team. And what came out of that was a newspaper interview. We've got a little picture of that. So Wallace had a column in the New York Post. And the first thing he does is publish an edited interview with Ayn Rand. So this is like December 1957. People are deciding what to put under the Christmas tree, and here's Mike Wallace, giving Ayn Rand some publicity for Atlas Shrugged. Early in 1958, Atlas Shrugged was nominated for the National Book Award for Best Work of Fiction by an American Writer. And in the publicity running up to that event, here's Mike Wallace at an industry event called the Publishers Ad Club. It's in New York City, and all the book reviewers and book people from around the country are there watching these interviews. And here's Mike Wallace interviewing Ayn Rand. I think we have a picture from a Publishers Weekly article of him interviewing her. And so there was that publicity. And then all these book reviewers and reporters went back to their newspapers and wrote up the interview. Like I was looking at one in the San Francisco Examiner where the reporter was reporting on Mike Wallace's interview with Ayn Rand, and it was very interesting to everybody and controversial that Wallace asked her, "Who's your favorite living author?" And she says, "Well, Mickey Spillane." And of course, that was scandalous and weird to people that this author of a deep philosophical book would like a pulp fiction author like Mickey Spillane, and that was newsworthy in itself. And that led a few years later to the actual Mike Wallace interview with Rand and Spillane in the same room. So then we get to the TV interview that we're celebrating. I think it's interesting that Wallace and Rand by this time were familiar with each other. So they had already done in-person interviews, and Wallace was familiar with her views and so forth. They were both mature, adults in their professions. Wallace was 40 years old at this time of the interview you're going to see, and Rand was 54. Now, sometimes people mistakenly think this interview was shown on ABC TV as a national broadcast, but that's not the case. Wallace, because of the success of Night Beat, this local New York City show we talked about, Wallace got immediate interest from the national networks, and he was negotiating a contract with ABC TV, and he did get an interview show on ABC nationally that lasted a year. But it was something of a disaster. Not one, but two of the interview subjects they had, a guy named Mickey Cohen and a columnist named Drew Pearson, both said things on the air in the interview that got Wallace and ABC sued. They got sued for slander, for defamation. So he was, there were some mistakes in judgment and so forth. And suffice it to say that after the end of a year, the ABC show was shut down. It went on, it limped on a little while longer in a kind of modified form. But by the time he interviewed Rand, he was back on local TV in New York City, Channel 13. When you watch the video, you'll see a placard at the beginning. It says NTA's Telestudios. The WNTA was an experimental station in New York City, kind of like a precursor of PBS. So that's some of the backstory there. ARI obtained the rights to place this interview on our YouTube channel in July 2020, I think it was. Maybe that's more than 2 years ago. And since then, it's probably attracted more viewers than it did in New York City when it was released. And I want to, there's a little more to this story of the historical context, and I want to bring in Brandon at this point because he's deep in the archives. He's getting more and more familiar with the collections, and I was a little confused about what the next interviews were, and Brandon jumped into the archives. You want to talk a little bit about the last 2 or 3 interviews, Brandon?
Yeah, sure, Tom. Well, I think most people don't realize that there were actually 4 Mike Wallace interviews with Ayn Rand. Of course, the 1959 interview that I think mostly everyone here, is familiar with or will be familiar with soon after you watch it shortly. But there was another interview in May of 1960, and then 2 more in 1961. And I'll just mention really quickly that the last of those interviews, October 1961, Ayn Rand and Mickey Spillane interviewed by Mike Wallace, that is available on Ayn Rand Institute's YouTube channel. So I really highly recommend, if you enjoyed this interview, please do go watch it. It's really fascinating. Now, we don't have the recording of the May 1960 or April 1961 recordings, but we do know about them. And that is, of course, thanks to this wealth of information that we have in the Ayn Rand archives. So I really just want to bring awareness to the fact that it is an absolute treasure trove of information about everything related to Ayn Rand. So everything from the newspaper clippings, advertising the interview. We know that it was, a TV interview, and we have the newspaper clippings advertising that. We have the personal calendar of Ayn Rand, day by day, the days that she recorded, and she marked the days that they were released. And so there are some really sort of special pieces of history, that you can find in the Ayn Rand archives. And I just want to draw attention to that. Now, what's really kind of special about, the 1960 interview, so this is the second interview that they did together, is that it actually, gained a response, as Tom mentioned, from Barry Goldwater. There had been an exchange between Mike Wallace, who at the time was somewhat known as like a liberal, and he had a criticism of Barry Goldwater, and Ayn Rand actually defended him on the air. And that was something that was, it prompted a response from Barry Goldwater, sent a letter to Ayn Rand that we have in the archives. And she writes, Barry to Ayn Rand saying, many people have told me of your appearance on the Mike Wallace show the other evening and how you defended my position against Mr. Wallace. I am particularly proud of the fact that you were the one to do it, because I've enjoyed very few books in my life as much as I have yours, Atlas Shrugged. Again, thank you. Best wishes, Barry Goldwater. And you can read their entire exchange in this book, Letters of Ayn Rand. And I do highly recommend, you pick up a copy of this, because it is just absolutely fascinating. But we also have Ayn Rand's response to Barry Goldwater. He had sent her a copy of his book, Conscience of a Conservative, where he sort of just defends what he calls, the conservative philosophy. And you can read this really fascinating lengthy response that she gives, where she says there is no such thing as a conservative philosophy, and has a lot of critiques to say, towards Goldwater. So it's just a really great exchange to read. Now, of course, as many people do know, she did support Goldwater in the 1964 election. So this was a part of a correspondence going on. And I think when you read these letters, you really see the ways in which Ayn Rand was deeply involved in just, in history. I mean, this is a very, important figure. Now, a little bit more about Wallace himself. He was very used to, I think, as Tom mentioned, used to interviewing people who had something to hide. And he was really trying to get the controversy out of the discussion. One of his writers says the worst crime to Mike Wallace was an hour of dull talk. So Mike Wallace, in his interview with Ayn Rand, which you can, by the way, read in this book, 100 Voices, a collection of oral history interviews, he says, I found her fascinating. I found her good company. She was the perfect guest, and she couldn't have been more forthcoming. So she was really like the perfect guest for this kind of show, where it was all about getting to the real conversations versus he mentions like Adlai Stevenson. He was a candidate for two-time candidate for president. And he says they would bore you the second they started talking. So he was not really interested in sort of, interviewing conventional people who had nothing interesting to say. He wanted, really, really interesting people. But I think it's also worth bringing up the really fascinating story about how this interview came to be in the first place. As Tom mentioned, there had been sort of this pre-existing relationship, some interviews, relating, Mike Wallace and Ayn Rand, but several members of Mike Wallace's staff became fans of Ayn Rand. And I think it's a just fascinating story how this happened. So Al Ramris was a writer and longtime associate of Mike Wallace. And he, another member of the staff, they'd been reading The Fountainhead, had read Atlas Shrugged, and was just talking about it. And he was just thought it was just the most bizarre thing, because Al Ramris, he says, I went to the City College of New York, which was like a leftist boot camp. And, just the idea of talking about capitalism was ridiculous to me. And anybody who wasn't a liberal, that just seemed to be like a totally non-intellectual position. And so, of course, basically he had this conversation with a colleague of his at the Mike Wallace studio. And she said, well, do you want to meet her? And he's like, well, how can I pass up this opportunity? So he actually went over, Al Ramris in 1958, went over Ayn Rand's house, met Frank O'Connor, her husband, and they had a little, dinner party. And during that dinner party, the subject of the critical reviews that Atlas Shrugged had received came up. And remember, Al Ramris is maybe a somewhat cocky 28-year-old kid, and he sort of recounts the story, saying he's a little embarrassed to say that this is what happened, but this is, according to him, this is what he said. They're talking about the negative reviews, and he says to Ayn Rand, right? Imagine saying this. He says, well, maybe the reason why you're getting all these lousy reviews is because you're a lousy writer. I hadn't read a word of her novel or any writing, and he said that to her. I mean, just imagine, right? But in fact, Ayn Rand didn't get angry. She just walked to the other room, grabbed a copy of Atlas Shrugged, and handed it to him and said, find me any lousy writing in this. And he's like, well, there's more than 1,000 pages, so this shouldn't be too hard to find. He looks for a really lengthy passage. And he's like, okay, this block of text, there's got to be lousy writing in here. Turns out it's the scene in Atlas Shrugged where Hank Rearden, it's, about his psychological position of being a producer, but also somebody who believes the mystics philosophy. And so it's like this really just powerful scene, one of my favorite scenes in Atlas Shrugged. And he starts reading it out loud. And Al Ramris recounts, he's like, I didn't have to read any more than half a paragraph to know there was something very special about this novel and this woman. And of course, he had to admit that, you're right. Like, this is really special stuff. And he became quite a big fan of Ayn Rand, which I think is just a spectacular story. And apparently they ended the night on a friendly note, even though he had said, I think, a very rude and unfriendly thing to Ayn Rand, and she would have every right to maybe just throw him out of the apartment at that point. But she just, one-upped him by handing him a copy of Atlas. And he also says something really nice in his interview in 100 Voices. He says, Miss Rand's greatest gift to us, along with her books, was the example she set for intellectual courage and integrity. Here is a woman who dared to stand virtually alone against ideas, political systems, and cultures that were dominating the planet and had been hollowed by intellectuals for centuries. What heroism! And I think you'll really see that in the interview that you're about to see. That Rand is not somebody who, in any sense of the word, shied away from controversy. She confronted it head on. So the seminal moment of that, the real instance where I think you see that come forward, of course, is when Mike Wallace on air confronts her with a critical review that was published of Atlas Shrugged in Newsweek. And he, remember, this is the typical Mike Wallace fashion, the camera slowly zooming in on the person being interviewed, the bright lights. And it's really just sort of meant to just really put you in the center focus, like a police interview. And kind of get your reaction, get your emotions, like of embarrassment or whatever. But Ayn Rand confronts it head on. So Mike Wallace says, I read this review that said you're out to destroy almost every edifice in the contemporary American way of life. Our Judeo-Christian values, our modified government-regulated capitalism, our rule by the majority will. Others have said you scorn churches and the concept of God. He says, are these accurate criticisms? To which he says, yes. Doesn't mince with word at all. She says, I agree with the facts, but not the estimate of these criticisms. And then goes on to give a very confident, projection of her ideas. Everything from ethics, of course, sex, love, romance, politics, and sort of this ideal system. And then, of course, a little bit about who she is. So you get a real spectrum of, I think, Ayn Rand's personality, her confidence. And I think you can really see why she was so influential in her lifetime, because she did not shy away from the fact that she was controversial. And she confronted it head on. And I think that kind of courage gave other people courage. And I can speak to that a little bit myself. I had read The Fountainhead in seventh grade for the first time. I was much too young to have read it. So I was kind of groping with these ideas that Ayn Rand had put forward, but I was a little embarrassed about it. It was the sort of thing that I was shy to express to other people. I wasn't really sure about myself in terms of conversations with other people. And so my first exposure to Ayn Rand, outside of just, the famous Talbot photo that's on the back of The Fountainhead, was the Mike Wallace interview. And I watched that and I saw this just deeply confident woman. And it was the first time I'd ever heard Ayn Rand speak or just see her on video. And it really gave me a great deal of courage to think that here is a woman, standing alone, standing on the courage of her convictions. It's a really incredible interview. And I think like Howard Roark and The Fountainhead, that kind of courage gives someone, the courage to face a lifetime. And that's a really important thing, I think, as us as intellectuals, communicating these ideas out in the world, to do the same, to really be courageous in our presentation of these ideas and not to be shy about it. And lastly, just on a final personal note, because I've been dating my girlfriend Kayla for 6.5 years, and she's a big fan of Ayn Rand. But when we first met, she had never heard of her. So it was one of these things where it's well, how do you introduce somebody to this philosophy or just to Ayn Rand and to communicate, all that she meant to me. So we're about a month into dating, and I suggested that we watch the Mike Wallace interview together because I thought, this is just kind of my first exposure. It was really a meaningful interview for me. I'm sure it would be, for her. And so we sat down together, watched it. And when we get to the section about romance, Mike Wallace leans in and he says, well, you in your book, you talk about, romance like it's a business deal of some kind. Isn't the whole idea of love that it's above self-interest? And she gives this really incredible answer about just unpacking all of the sort of false dichotomies and the sort of built-in assumptions that is built into a question like that. And it's a just great answer. But after that answer, Kayla, she turns to me and she says, well, now I have to read this book. And I'm happy to say that she did. She's read each of the fictional works multiple times. They mean a great deal to her personally. They've, both her and I, we've, grown together, understanding this philosophy and have used it as a means to, improve our lives, which I think really that's what this is all about. So I have a big thanks to Mike Wallace and the fact that this interview exists, because it was a way to really give me a lot of courage and then also to introduce someone I deeply care about to this philosophy. So I don't know what I would have done. I don't know what my second option would have been. Anyway, if there are people out there who want to introduce this, the philosophy to their friends, I think this can potentially be a really good starting point. I'll leave that
I think this
suggestion
is kind of
out
a
there.
this is the kind of experience we're looking for, and you know, we have actually a testimonial from a high school student who wrote in. I don't know if you have that in front of you, Brandon, but it's a high school
Oh, I
student
do.
talking about this particular interview and her experience with it. Do you want to read
Yeah,
that?
yeah. So this is from Gayatri, a high school student, and she recounts that in her AP language class, that she says we watched an interview that Ayn Rand had with the journalist Mike Wallace, and I was especially captivated by the objective and clear standards by which she based her philosophy. The well thought out way in which she stated her opinions and the reason and rationality which underscored her words gave a certain elegance that drew her to me. Thus, I want to read Atlas Shrugged, not simply because it is a tenet of literature, but because I want a more expansive understanding of the compelling and uniquely resonant ideas of Ayn Rand. It's yeah, that's a quote from a high school student. So you can really see how this is an interview I think that compels people from all ages. And one of the interesting things I'll just add as well that I've seen in some of the comments on this video is people saying in the comments like, I really wish TV interviews were like this today. I mean, it's very rare, I think, to see the kind of approach that Mike Wallace takes, and then of course just like the perfect guest that Ayn Rand was. So it kind of gives you a window into a different world, I think, compared to a lot of things that are in news journalism today.
Yeah, and then the kind of impact Brandon's talking about really is what we're about at the Ayn Rand Institute. Our mission is to foster awareness and understanding and acceptance of Ayn Rand's philosophy. And interviews like this, events like this, you know, help us do that with the assistance of donors. And thanks to all the donors who are watching. If you're not a donor, I hope you become one. This kind of content's made available, you know, free because of the passion of our donors. So be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I think we're about ready to wind up, unless you've got anything else, Brandon.
Yeah, we did have just one question that was posed in the chat here from Vadiums, I believe. And it says, can you also comment on the interview of Ayn Rand with Donahue? Thank you. I don't know that we can comment much on that today with the limited amount of time we have, other than to say I also recommend those interviews because I think they're just absolutely fascinating. She did, to my knowledge, 2 interviews with Phil Donahue, and the same kind of appeal as this one, where it's a lot of just like great questions and there's really great and captivating answers from Ayn Rand. I don't know if you have any more to say about that, about other TV interviews
No,
that Rand did in her lifetime.
there's so much to say. We'll have to have other events. All I can say
Right.
is that I do see a note that we had a big super chat contribution. I wasn't aware that we were going to have super chat on this event, but um, thanks for that. Thanks for your support. And let's buckle up and go back to 1959 and watch this interview.